In honor of talking about raiding yesterday, we have to commemorate today, 8th of June, 793. Why? Because today is the day Vikings are landing on the shores of Great Britain. It's the day they are raiding the abbey at Lindisfarne in Northumbria, which is going to mark the start of the Norse raids inside the British Isles. And that's all for raiding, because today instead we are talking about, I guess, dungeoneering. Yesterday we had our report for raiding, whereas today we're gonna go into the report for Mythic Plus. This is the other activity, the other end game activity for PvE that has been consumed by the population of this game for about 6 months up to now. There have been a lot of changes, a lot of shifts in power, some plot twists, some Deus Ex Machina coming in and changing the status quo of some of these specs in Mythic Plus. So I will start by giving you this. And you're like, Eisen, I can't fucking see anything in this. Look at this shit. It's full of lines. I can't really. Okay, fine. Okay, calm down. The only reason I wanted to put this up is because amongst all of the clusterfuck of lines, you can kind of see 3 trends right here. Trend number 1 is that there is a big chunk of colors closer to the bottom, and trend number 2 is that there is another chunk of colors closer to the top. This is the performance of classes and specs in Mythic Plus, the keys they have been doing, the level of the keys they have been doing, etc, etc. The third trend, on the other hand, is you can see 3 rogue lines defecting from the bottom, leaving, possibly escaping the bottom to meet, to go ahead and join the top half. You can see the first one, the earlier one, towards the end of March, was Elemental Shaman. You can see them crossing from the bottom to the top. They have been buffed. Specifically, when it comes to Mythic Plus, the buff was centered around their AoE damage, their more consistent Earthquake and Chain Lightning damage being given to them in 9.0.5. You have another buff, which was given to Havoc Demon Hunter, and that's the other line that is going to break through and go ahead in the top half. And then the last one of the lines is, of course, the yellow one, which is Assassination Rogue. Another one of the specs that have been granted quite a few buffs over time and eventually made it in the top half. So that was the only purpose of showing you this salad of unintelligible lines, because that's the only thing you can see clearly, the change in power basically by these 3 specs over the course of the first tier. Another thing I wanted to show, just to see that sometimes shouting for disaster, shouting for doom and gloom, you could say, Windwalker Monk. You can see that Windwalker Monk had a pretty good growth. They went up to a certain point. They were the most represented Mythic Plus melee spec for a few weeks. I reported on this for several weeks back when we were updating the current state of Mythic Plus almost weekly, and I was pointing out how Windwalker was, continuing to grow, continuing to rise, and then you have the drop. The drop was the 30th of March. It was, the crossing into 9.0.5, which hotfixed Windwalker. Their beneficial bug, which allowed their Storm, Earth, and Fire images to continue channeling Fist of Fury, even while you were casting other abilities, was hotfixed, meaning Windwalker Monk was losing quite a lot of power, specifically in AoE, but it didn't last long. In a couple of weeks, Windwalker went back to performing as usual. So that type of doomsaying related to the hotfix of Windwalker didn't really have too much of an effect when it comes to Mythic Plus performances. Then for spec-specific and spec-related things, I wanted to stop for a bit and talk about the same thing I had to talk about yesterday in raiding, which was mages and warlocks and their disparity. You can see the mage in Mythic Plus doesn't really differ too much from raiding. The top line, I don't want to spoil things, but the top line here is Fire Mage. Yes, indeed. And then the middle one is Frost, and the bottom one is Arcane. So unfortunately, despite having the possibility or having the chance, which is something that happened before, this is not something new, it's not something impossible to imagine, that you have a pure DPS class that has one spec very good for Mythic Plus and one spec very good for raiding. Rogues, for example, used to have this happen very often, with Outlaw being good in Mythic Plus and then either Subtlety or Assassination being the specs to go. in raiding. In this case, not really. In this case, Mage has completely and utterly dominated this first tier when it comes to Mage specs. I paired them with Warlock because Warlock is in the exact same situation. This is Warlock, and of course, I'm sorry, I will have to spoil you again. Yes, the top line is Affliction. Then you have Demology and Destro at the bottom, which is the same configuration of raiding. This is possibly even more unlikely. Affliction has always had deep problems in Mythic Plus. Their crutch was always the fact that they had to use dots, they had to ramp up, they simply did not have the time to be valuable in Mythic Plus because stuff dies too quickly for their dots to do anything, and they lacked a lot of burst, which is also very valuable and wanted, needed in Mythic Plus. That was also shattered this expansion. It's not that Affliction is a super high burst spec or their AoE has suddenly become great, but it has become good enough compared to also how strong they are in single target damage that it's still overtaking both Demonology and Destruction in Mythic Plus as well. Then we close with the last of the specs for DPS, which is Warriors. The reason why I'm pointing out Warriors is because unlike Warlocks and unlike Mages, there is actually a shift in power here. This is Warrior, and as you can see, after a month and a half-ish of the release of this expansion, we have the change. We have the change of the guard, where Arms is being overtaken by Fury. I don't know if you have memory tracking back this long, or if you simply didn't care back at the time, but for the first few weeks, for the first month and a half or so, Arms was actually the more wanted, needed, used spec in both Mythic Plus and raids. Most of the warriors in raids were Arms as well. And at the time, it was a pretty dire situation. Warriors were pretty bad, like pretty bad. The only reason why you wanted one Arms warrior in the first place was the fact that you had no protection warrior and you wanted the shout or the rallying cry. Since then, Warrior, you can say, has made quite big strides. It's been one of the more, I guess, improved specs compared to the start. Fury Warrior has been granted quite a few number of buffs over the time. I think 4 times they have been buffed. Whereas Arms Warrior, not really. They have been left behind a bit, which is also why, at this point, Arms Warrior is being outperformed by Fury in both raids and Mythic Plus. Yes, Arms is the one being buffed in 9.1 as opposed to Fury, because I guess Blizzard is trying to correct the trend that they themselves generated throughout 9.0 and 9.0.5 of buffing Fury and kind of leaving Arms behind. And then for a second we stop checking out the DPS and instead we look at healers. I wanted to show you first what is most important, I guess, for healers, which is this. The fight, the head-to-head between Paladin and Restoration Shaman. As you can see, they have been going together for quite a long time. Eventually, slowly, but eventually, Paladin has taken over. The more Paladins also moving to Ashen Hallow, the more Paladins becoming Ventir and being more requested for high keys due to their damage is also what is sort of bridging this gap, because the higher you go, the more healer DPS is important, and the more healer DPS is important, the least Restoration Shaman is valuable compared to a Holy Paladin. They can still hold their own thanks to their Earthquake legendary on their Earth Elemental. It can still have some pretty good uses, but obviously it's nothing comparable to a Paladin, a Holy Paladin's burst damage. When you bring in all the other healers, all the rest of the gang, you can see there is only just one big bad outlier at the bottom, which is Mistweaver. Restoration Druid is still on the low end, especially when you consider the pedigree of Restoration Druid, which is top healer in Mythic Plus. It's a title they held for like 2 expansions in a row, so it's still kind of weird to see them that low, but not in as dire of a situation as Mistweaver. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the Holy Priest, because technically up to the first month or so, Holy Priest was the worst of the healers. It was the one that was performing the least and also the least represented and requested. But over time, you can see that Holy Priest has made the most strides, the most improvement by a lot actually, to get towards the top half. Yes, they are still not really up to Shaman or Paladin standards, but they have definitely gone up to be a respectable healer, you can say. And we will see also later on in the participation numbers. The last one of these graphs of performance and activity in Mythic Plus is on tanks, which is also going to be our shortest one because it kind of is self-explanatory. You have two branches here, you have two gangs. Gang number 1 is Vengeance, Brewmaster, and Guardian Druid. What is also interesting is that this gang has remained the same for 6 months. There has been no up and down here, there has been no changing of the guard, there has been no passing here. They have basically been at the same since the start. The only difference is that Guardian Druid is the one to have breached the gap more. You can say that for the first 3 months or so of this expansion, it was just Brewmaster and Vengeance. The other 4 specs were together at the bottom, and Guardian Druid is the one that was able to just divide itself, distance itself from the bottom 3 and get much closer to Vengeance and Brewmaster. Protection Warrior, Protection Paladin, and Blood Death Knight, on the other hand, have been staying at the bottom for quite a while. Now, that was just mostly the performance. How well did they perform in Mythic Plus? Also, you could also get some ideas on how many keys, or rather how high are the keys that these specs are running, but not too much about the participation. For example, we saw that Protection Paladin was towards the bottom of performance, even though Protection Paladin is the most played tank in the game, when you take into account all keys, all levels of difficulty, etc, etc. Same can be said for Holy Priest, one of the more popular specs, full of, raid leaders, girlfriends, and whatnot. Now, how has the performance of Mythic Plus been over the course of 6 months? Have we gotten any changes? Have we gotten any improvements? Or have things gone for the worse? So, this entire thing is for the purpose of looking towards 9.1. Are we getting into 9.1 in a worse situation than we got into this expansion? Are things even more extreme when it comes to representation? Do we have a complete tyranny of a certain spec in a certain role, suffocating all the rest? Or has it gotten better? Now, starting with tanks, it has gotten better. I can give you the spoiler immediately. Tanks started out at a pretty suffocating pace. This was after the first month and a half of representation in Mythic Plus, and you saw that for most of the keys, tank was dominated by Vengeance, Demon Hunter. Even in plus 15 level, it was still over a third of all tanks being populated by Vengeance. The other specs were sort of fighting for scraps, with Protection Warrior being the only odd one out. And when you looked at the plus 20, so the high level of Mythic Plus, it was over 2/3 of all tanks being represented by Vengeance. So, over the course, this was the representation, for example, by the end of January, this was by the end of February. As it continued on this pace, as it continued to get worse for the other tanks. Look at this. Definitely not. Over the course of the following 3.5-ish months to this point where we are now, we have gotten much more representation for the other tanks, particularly for Guardian Druid. We have gotten to see a rise in the MDI tournament, the Great Push, which did use quite a few Guardian Druids in keys that benefit from having bigger pulls, using a bigger cooldown, as opposed to the Vengeance 1-minute short cooldowns that are easily repeatable pack by pack. Certain dungeons were fit for a huge incarnation pull for a Guardian Druid, so Guardian Druid gained a lot of representation. So did Brewmaster and Prot Paladin in comparison to where they were before. So it is definitely gotten more healthy for all tanks, which is also kind of expected, because up to 3.5 months ago, the highest keys were in the 23 level, whereas now they are in the 27 level, which means there is an easier barrier of entry in plus 20s, so other tanks can join in more. Now, what about, on the other hand, what about healers? Healers is the clump of players that change the least. So we have gotten to see over time, which we reported on multiple times, the rise of Holy Paladin. Holy Paladin has continued to get more and more represented over the course of the several weeks after June and February, up to the point where they became the second most played spec, especially in higher keys. We left them with this split a few months ago, and now they are looking like this. Paladin is basically matching Restoration Shaman, and then the other specs are far below them. The only other major thing to mention here is the same thing I mentioned in the performance a few minutes ago when I talked about Holy Priest. Holy Priest was at 2%, sometimes 1%, and over the course of a few months they have now gotten much, much closer to Discipline Priest. That was the main bigger change when it came to healers, but the status quo has remained tightly in the firm grip of both Restoration Shaman and Holy Paladin. Now on to the DPS, starting with the range DPS. What changes have we seen in this time? Now the main change that we saw for range DPS was the fact that Marksmanship Hunter was hotfixed and lost quite a bit of AoE damage. Since then, it's been a slow decline. Hunter at its peak reached almost 30% representation in ranged DPS. It was fighting and beating Fire Mage and Balanced Druid at times. They were the more represented one. Since then, it's been slowing down in its representation. Beast Mastery has been gaining more and more ground. In plus 15s, it looked like this back then. This was back in February, the end of February, compared to how it looks now. As you can see, it went from basically 24.5% to 17% for marksmanship. You see the rise of Elemental Shaman, thanks to their AoE buff, and also a flattening of the curve when it comes to mages. We have gotten more representation of Frost and slightly less of Fire Mage. When you look at the higher keys, it is even possibly more stark, the difference. You can see here, marksmanship is at 28, and Elemental Shaman is at 0.7. Fast forward 4 months, and now Elemental Shaman is at 8.2, while marksmanship has fallen to 16%. So marksmanship lost almost 50% of its representation, whereas Elemental Shaman representation increased by 12 times compared to what they had before. The other thing worth mentioning is that whereas Balanced Druid went from 28% of its representation to 28% of its representation, the one who lost the more is Fire Mage, who went from 36 to 27. So to make space, basically, to make space for more Shadow Priests, more Elemental Shamans, a few more Warlocks, as you can see here, and a few more Frost Mages, it's Fire who has lost more, together with Marksmanship Hunter. Now, what about, instead, melee DPS? So, melee DPS did have quite a few changes over time. We covered, back then, the rise of Windwalker Monk. Just like we did in raids, the fact that Windwalker Monk was becoming more and more represented and performing better and better and better up to the point they received their hotfix nerf. We also covered the rise of Fury Warrior as they quickly passed arms and they kept gaining more and more representation. We also covered the slow fall of Unholy Death Knight by the weeks. At the start, if you remember, Unholy was like everywhere. And then also with great sadness and great fear of the future, we covered the rise of Havoc Demon Hunter, which was sitting at 7 to 8, sometimes 9% representation, and it kept getting higher and higher and higher. Up to the point of today, where Havoc Demon Hunter is the most represented melee DPS spec in 15 keys and higher, all combined. This is the first time in the expansion that Havoc Demon Hunter has become the more popular spec. When you look at the difference with the plus 20 is also pretty clear, the difference. You can see that back to a few months ago, Fury Warrior was just at 6%. You had Rogue all the way up to 40 and Windwalker all the way up to 32, and there was basically little to no room for the rest. But when you look at now, you can see, of course, the boom of Havoc going from 4 to 14%, and as well as Fury Warrior going from 6 to 16%. That has been the main difference when it comes to melee DPS. The change for the better in terms of their performance of both Fury Warrior and Havoc Demon Hunter. As mentioned before, despite Assassination performing much better, this was one of the examples, it's still not very popular. It is still a much better suited spec for raids, for single target, not really much burst and AoE available to them to be very popular in Mythic Plus. So Outlaw is still keeping that scepter, that mantle of the more popular spec. So when you look at all of these specs and you make a final reading of the first season, you can say quite certainly, quite clearly, I guess, you can say that tanks went to a better place. No, they didn't die. They have become more even in terms of spread of power. You still have problems with Protection Warrior, as mentioned, Protection Warrior, Paladin, and Blood Decay being a little bit on the lower end, a couple of which are going to be buffed in 9.1, but we have seen the better participation of Guardian Druid over time. Brewmaster Monk as well has remained pretty decent and usable, together with the popular one, which is Vengeance. When you go to healers, Restoration Shaman and Paladin have remained there, together lower down with Discipline and a rise of Holy Priest. The only two outliers are still Restoration Druid and, more importantly, Mistweaver. So if there was one complaint to be had when it comes to healers, aside from the main complaint, okay, aside from the mother of all complaints, which is Holy Paladin does too much damage, the other complaint is Mistweaver Monk hasn't really been given much to work with so far. For melee DPS, we started with just Rogue and Unholy Death Knight. You have gotten over time Windwalker to join the party, you have gotten Havoc Demon Hunter to join the party, and you have gotten Warrior, Fury Warrior, to join the party. So it has gotten much more varied for the melee DPS group as well. And lastly, for the range DPS, we started with a complete monopoly, or rather oligarchy, of fire balance marksmanship, and this lasted for months. Eventually, marksmanship has started losing ground, elemental shaman has started gaining more and more. I guess you could still say that not enough has been done to Warlock specs as a whole to make them any more desirable in Mythic Plus, as well as technically Shadow Priest, who did get possibly a semblance of popularity for a while until their Shadow Prism legendary was nerfed, so they sort of plateaued at not really that popular of a state right now. Either way, what we can draw from this is that every single role in Mythic Plus has become more varied and, I guess, more inclusive of a multitude of specs towards the end of the first tier, which is the purpose of making this video. This means that coming into 9.1, you're getting into it with more specs having a chance. We started 9.0, so we started the expansion with much fewer specs, being considered strong and powerful. Now we are ending 9.0.5 and starting 9.1 with way more specs in the pool of possibly strong ones. Not to mention, some of these specs are in line for some buffs, right? And nerfs, because Fire and Balanced Druid, for example, are bound to be nerfed coming into 9.1, whereas Frost Mage, for example, is going to be buffed. So that could also further make more room for more specs. Maybe you get into a situation where Fire is now comparable to Frost Mage and you can use both. Maybe the Warlock specs being buffed, like Destruction Warlock, becomes a viable spec to play. And this is going to further open up the possibilities of specs being powerful. Many, yes, of course, very likely the absolute highest of keys and the highest of players are not going to go for all this variety, and they are just going to pinpoint which are the absolute strongest of specs and just play those. But that's not what should matter to you. 0.1% of the player base will actually be interested in that, whereas everyone else would be perfectly fine with, you know, Destruction Warlock being represented 9% of all runs. That's gonna be more than enough to be included in, you know, in keys higher than 20 and, you know, high level keys without having to necessarily be some MDI level of power. Pretty much, for example, the state of Fury Warrior right now, which is not really been used that much in MDI level pro plays, but it is still a popular, strong spec which is easily invitable in Mythic Plus groups. That's a good state to be in. So this was the recap of the day after going over raiding yesterday. This was the Mythic Plus version. Not much to say, to be honest, about the differences in bosses, in encounters, in damage profiles and healing profiles, because Mythic Plus is going to be the exact same with the exact same dungeons, so there's not going to be much to talk about. And also, it's a little bit too early to talk about the new affix and how it's going to shape things up, so that's going to be left up for later. Thank you guys for watching the video, and you should probably subscribe at the very least to be able to maintain me and my constant purchasing of medical supplies, since this is the 7th day of continuous lawn mowing outside of my house. It looks like I live in a fucking jungle. I don't know what they are doing, but it is quite annoying. So thank you guys anyways. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, And now, apparently, turns out I have an allergy because my nose keeps twitching. Fuck.